To die for. How often do we hear that phrase? That creme brulee was to die for. Did you see that vintage dress she was wearing? To die for. And how about that drummer? To die for. What I'm really in the market for right now is a cemetery plot to die for. I'm trying to clean up my life in neat piles so that down the road, when my soul takes off to what I hope is higher ground, my kids won't have to deal with a bunch of decisions. One thing I needed to solve, like Eliza Doolittle, was what's to become of me, was what to do with my remains when the time comes. The decision seemed pretty clear. Like I should just go be buried in my hometown, Rock Island, Illinois, where my parents are, my grandparents, a whole bunch of relatives, and where I grew up. Figured it would be just easy. And what I liked about that cemetery is it was always very honest and straightforward. You were buried in the order you died. Boom, boom, boom. Next. Well, my eyes were opened when I went to a funeral a few years ago of a friend of mine who I'd grown up with in the community. She was not buried next in line. In fact, she was in her own fresh row. And I couldn't figure out why, but I looked behind and I realized that her in-laws were buried 2 rows behind her, and that one day when her husband died, he'd be buried next to her, and they'd have a nice little family unit there. I thought, well, new rules. This is great. I walked down her road, this longitude and latitude of monuments, and I thought, this is great. I can be down the road from her and 2 rows in front of my parents. A couple days later, I called the cemetery committee and spoke to a guy, Leonard, who I'd grown up with. He was delighted to hear of my interest in wanting to rest in eternity in our hometown. And I was very happy for the welcome until it wasn't so welcoming because I learned all kinds of rules and regs. I told him about my plot to be near my parents, and he says, well, you really can't be in the middle of a row because those are reserved for married couples. Now, I didn't want to start getting into it with him about the discrimination against single people, but I tried to be creative and open. And I said, Leonard, what if I just buy the whole plot and am buried there by myself? No, that won't work because we won't know in the future who would be buried next to you. And you're not allowed to be buried next to a man who is not your relative. Oh boy. I'm thinking my track record with living men hasn't been that great. I certainly was not worried about the dead ones. So I said, well, walk over here with me to the end of my parents' row. There seems to be a space at the end of their row, row 22. There seems to be room for a single grave here. Oh, no, you can't do that because women aren't allowed to be buried on the end of a row next to the driveway. It's like, Leonard, this can't really be a safety issue. I'd already be dead, right? He says, come with me. And I wanted to see what clever plan he had come up with. We walked right past my parents' graves, and now he's showing me in row 23, very close to them, a little space about this wide. Like maybe for my dog. This looked like a pet cemetery space. I said, explain. He says, well, we could move dearly departed Suzanne over a little bit and tuck you in right here. I said, let me understand something. I can't be in the middle of a row because it's for married people. I can't be buried next to a man I'm not related to. And I can't be on an end cap. But you're willing to move a deceased person who's been there for many years already and her monument over? I said, and how do you think her family would feel about that? He says, oh, I'm sure Suzanne's family would be delighted. I said, this is not acceptable. I said, come with me. We walked over to the old part of the cemetery where my grandparents are, a couple of uncles, one of whom died a couple years before I was born. There seemed to be a single space next to him. I said, Leonard, look at this. It's next to my relative. It's not on an end cap. It's in the middle. It's in the middle of a row, but a single space. How about this? Well, that would be great, except someone's already purchased that plot to be near his uncle on the other side. I threw up my hands in the air. I was out of ideas. My blood pressure and temperature were both rising. And I said, he said, well, think about it. I said, well, Leonard, I'll think about it, but you haven't really given me much here to think about. On my 3-hour car ride back home, I spoke to a high school friend of mine, telling him about this dilemma. He says, well, I've got a perfect solution. Come be buried with me. He was now divorced from another classmate of ours. He says, I've got a plot all set up in the Catholic cemetery 6 blocks away. You could just come be buried there with me. Isn't this rich? My community, where I grew up, given me all this trouble about a gravesite there, and I would be welcome in the Catholic cemetery. Well, I had been out to that cemetery, and right next to his grave is a larger-than-life statue of St. Michael wrestling the devil. I thought, I just don't think I can do this. I don't know this statuary. It would give me a heart attack. And what about my parents? They would be rolling around in their very well-placed graves. I continued to drive, and when I got home, I settled into the sofa, and I looked on the shelf, and there was my urn holding my beloved dog, Murphy, who I had lost a couple years before. And I thought, this is the answer. I can take all the guilt off of my kids for not going to visit my grave in Rock Island, because why would they ever go there? They live in California. They're never coming back. I thought, take me, take Murphy, take us for a nice long walk on the beach. Dad always said, last one out of Rock Island, turn out the lights. Dad, my hand is on the switch, and I'd be on my way. And what makes this decision so monumental is not needing one.